The 17th of January, 1945. The Colmar Pocket, Alsace-Lorraine. The snow fell in silence across the shattered forests of eastern France, coating the skeletal remains of farmhouses and cratered earth in a deceptive softness. Morning fog clung to the frozen Ill River Valley like a shroud, and somewhere in that grey-white void, a single American soldier crouched motionless behind the charred timbers of what had once been a barn. In his hands rested an M1903 Springfield rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth by months of use. Beside him, impossibly out of place in this landscape of violence and deprivation, sat an ordinary tin coffee cup, dented, blackened by countless fires. Unremarkable, he placed it carefully on a broken beam 15 yards ahead, its dark interior facing the German lines. Then he settled into position and waited. His name was Corporal William Edward Jones, 23 years old, a farm boy from rural Pennsylvania who had never imagined that his childhood spent shooting groundhogs in his father's fields would prepare him for this. But war transforms the mundane into the essential, and what Jones understood what he had learned through bitter experience in the hedgerows of Normandy and the hell of the Hürtgen Forest was that survival often hinged not on courage or firepower, but on understanding the fundamental mathematics of attention. And in January 1945, trapped in the frozen hell of the Colmar Pocket, the German Wehrmacht was starving not just for food, but for hope, for normalcy, for any sign that the world they remembered still existed somewhere beyond the artillery barrages and the endless American advance. The Colmar Pocket represented one of the last German strongholds west of the Rhine, a salient of occupied territory jutting into Allied-controlled France like a dagger pointed at Strasbourg. Here, elements of the German 19th Army, battered veterans who had retreated up through southern France, had dug in with desperate tenacity. They were cut off, undersupplied, and increasingly aware that their war was ending badly. American forces, including the 3rd Infantry Division and French First Army units, had encircled them in a grinding winter offensive that turned every village into a fortress and every forest into a killing ground. For 6 weeks, from December 1944 through late January 1945, these forces clashed in brutal close quarters, combat across frozen terrain that offered no mercy and less comfort. Jones had arrived in this sector 3 days earlier as part of a specially tasked sniper-spotter team assigned to Company K, 7th Infantry Regiment. His orders were straightforward: interdict German movement, eliminate officers and NCOs, and create chaos in enemy positions without revealing American strength or intentions. But straightforward orders rarely accounted for the reality. Jones discovered a no-man's land, where German positions were dug in barely 200 yards from American lines, where visibility shifted from 30 feet to 300, depending on the fog's whims, and where both sides existed in a state of exhausted vigilance that made conventional tactics nearly suicidal. What Jones possessed, beyond his rural marksmanship skills, was an understanding of human nature sharpened by observation. He had watched German soldiers for months now, not just through his rifle scope, but through the lens of someone trying to understand what moved them, what distracted them, what made them human rather than simply targets. And he had noticed something that American intelligence reports and tactical manuals never quite captured. The Wehrmacht soldiers of 1945 were not the confident conquerors of 1940. They were exhausted, hungry men clinging to routines and rituals from a world that no longer existed, and those routines made them predictable. The coffee cup was Jones's experiment in applied psychology, born from a conversation 2 nights earlier with his spotter, Private First Class Danny Kowalski, a machinist's son from Detroit who possessed an engineer's mind for mechanical problems. They had been discussing the German habit of rotating sentries precisely on the hour, a clockwork regularity that seemed absurd given their tactical situation. Kowalski had theorized that the Germans were maintaining pre-war military discipline as a psychological bulwark against collapse, that the rituals of parade ground order were all that separated them from acknowledging their defeat. Jones had taken that insight and combined it with something he had learned hunting, animals investigating consistencies, and soldiers, when bored and exhausted, are no different. The cup sat there in the grey dawn light, and Jones waited. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The Germans would be changing their forward observation posts soon, the experienced sentries rotating back for their morning ersatz coffee and the new guards taking position. That transition moment, Jones had learned, was when men were most vulnerable, when the incoming sentry was still adjusting to the cold and the outgoing one was already mentally back at the dugout fire. And that was when a detail out of place, something that hadn't been there an hour ago, would catch attention just long enough. At 42 minutes past the hour, movement flickered in Jones's scope. A German soldier emerged partially from a camouflaged position 70 yards distant, visible only as a dark shape against snow. The soldier paused, and Jones could imagine the sequence happening in the man's mind. Is that a cup? What is an American cup doing there? Is it a booby trap? Should I report it? The German raised his head slightly for a better view, breaking the cardinal rule of concealment, and Jones's rifle spoke once. The soldier collapsed without a sound, and the forest returned to its suspended silence. Jones did not move. He reloaded smoothly, a motion practiced 10,000 times, and continued his vigil. The cup remained exactly where he had placed it, undisturbed, innocent, lethal in its ordinariness. 20 minutes later, another German soldier, perhaps investigating his comrade's silence, lifted his head above the trench line to scan the area. Jones fired again. The mathematics were merciless. In a war where artillery and machine guns killed dozens at a time, this single-shot precision felt almost intimate, almost personal, and infinitely more effective at creating paranoia than random suppressing fire could ever be. By midday, Jones had fired 11 rounds and registered 8 confirmed kills, each one documented by Kowalski's meticulous notes on range, conditions, and target behavior. But more importantly, the German position had gone silent. No more routine patrols, no more predictable sentry rotations, no movement at all. The coffee cup had done what a platoon assault could not. It had injected uncertainty into a system that ran on routine. Somewhere across that frozen no-man's land, German officers were now dealing with the realization that something fundamental had changed, that the basic assumptions about safe observation and covered positions no longer held true. What the Germans could not have known was that Jones was executing a variation of a tactic as old as warfare itself, using the enemy's expectations against them. But he was doing so with a peculiarly American twist, weaponizing the very symbols of American material abundance that had begun to corrode German morale throughout the entire Western Front. By late 1944, Wehrmacht soldiers were subsisting on diminishing rations, synthetic coffee made from acorns and barley, ersatz everything in a war economy that had stripped away comfort down to the caloric minimum. American soldiers, in contrast, lived in what seemed to Germanize like impossible luxury: real coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, canned food in bewildering variety. Captured German diaries from this period repeatedly expressed shock at American supply abundance, describing it in terms that mixed envy, resentment, and a dawning awareness that they were fighting an opponent who existed on an entirely different economic plane. The coffee cup was thus more than bait. It was a symbol of everything the Wehrmacht had lost and the Americans possessed: normalcy, abundance, the casual confidence to leave equipment lying about because there was always more. Jones understood this instinctively, and over the next 5 days, he refined his technique into something approaching psychological warfare, conducted one shot at a time. On the second day, January 18th, he varied the position of the cup, moving it 30 yards north to a different line of sight. The German defenders had presumably warned their troops about the original location, but the new placement caught 3 more soldiers who investigated the anomaly. Jones began to understand that he was not just fighting Germans, but fighting the human brain's pattern recognition systems, its inability to ignore discrepancies, its compulsion to investigate the unfamiliar, even when logic screamed danger. By the 3rd day, the psychological effect had metastasized beyond Jones's immediate kill zone. German activity along the entire company front had decreased markedly. Prisoner interrogations revealed that rumors had spread through the German lines about an American ghost sniper who could kill from impossible distances, who used mysterious signals and traps, who was everywhere and nowhere. The coffee cup had become mythologized in the retelling, transformed from a simple tin cup into various imagined devices, a radio beacon, a poisoned trap, a magical object. Jones, hearing these reports from intelligence officers, found them grimly amusing. The truth was far more prosaic and far more effective. He was simply a competent marksman exploiting cognitive biases and material scarcity. On the fourth and fifth days, Jones expanded his methodology. He began placing other objects, an abandoned canteen, a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, even a small American flag fragment. Each became a locus of attention. Each drew investigating eyes and exposed positions. Kowalski meticulously documented every engagement, noting that the average exposure time had dropped from 14 seconds to less than 8. The Germans were learning, but not fast enough. Jones's confirmed kill count climbed: 23, 37, 51. The numbers became abstract, disconnected from the weight of individual deaths, yet each shot was carefully considered, each target deliberately chosen for maximum psychological impact on survivors. What Jones experienced during those 6 days was something he would struggle to articulate years later, a strange dissociation where time stretched and compressed simultaneously, where the world narrowed to the circle of his rifle scope and the patient wait between heartbeats before the trigger press. He ate cold rations without tasting them, slept in 2-hour increments, and existed in a state of heightened awareness that was both exhausting and oddly clarifying. The coffee cup became his partner in a deadly routine, and he found himself caring for it with superstitious attention, cleaning it each evening, placing it with ritualistic precision each morning. The Germans, for their part, faced an impossible tactical problem. They could not ignore the objects because military discipline and curiosity demanded investigation. They could not simply shell the areas because ammunition was precious and the objects moved. They could not send teams to remove them because that exposed more soldiers to the unseen sniper. And gradually, inexorably, their defensive posture shifted from active vigilance to passive paralysis. Men hunkering deeper into frozen earth and refusing to look over their parapets, even when tactical necessity demanded it. On January 22nd, the 6th day, Jones recorded his 97th confirmed kill just after dawn. The target was a German officer identifiable by his binoculars and the way other soldiers had deferred to him, who had been scanning the American lines from a supposedly concealed position 400 yards distant. Jones had placed the coffee cup at maximum visible range, almost taunting the Germans to try to observe it. The officer had taken the bait, raising his binoculars for just 3 seconds too long. Jones compensated for wind, for the cold air's effect on trajectory, for the slight upward angle, and fired. The officer dropped, and somewhere in the German command structure, another voice of experience and leadership went silent. That afternoon, American forces launched a coordinated assault on the weakened German positions. Company K advanced across ground that Jones had dominated for nearly a week, and they met startlingly light resistance. The Germans withdrew rather than fight, their will broken not primarily by artillery or armor, but by 6 days of relentless psychological pressure, applied through a rifle scope and an ordinary coffee cup. Captured German soldiers spoke of the Kaffeetasse Teufel, the coffee cup devil, with a mixture of fear and exhausted relief that the ordeal was over. Jones emerged from his 6-day vigil gaunt, hollow-eyed, and curiously unmoved by the congratulations his commanders offered. He had done what was necessary, applied his particular skills to achieve a tactical objective, and survived. The coffee cup, dented and blackened, was eventually lost during the subsequent advance toward the Rhine, discarded or perhaps kept by some other soldier who never knew its history. Jones himself rarely spoke about those days, even decades later, finding the whole episode difficult to reconcile with his self-image as a farmer's son who had wanted nothing more than to survive the war and return to Pennsylvania. But what Jones had demonstrated perhaps more clearly than any number of after-action reports could convey, was a truth about the nature of modern warfare that transcended tactics and weaponry. He had shown that in a conflict between industrial democracies and authoritarian regimes, the war was not just fought with bullets and bombs, but with the accumulated weight of economic systems, with the psychological impact of abundance versus scarcity, with the erosion of belief in victory when every captured ration pack and discarded cigarette butt testified to the enemy's inexhaustible resources. The coffee cup was deadly not because it was booby-trapped or technologically sophisticated, but because it represented everything the Wehrmacht no longer possessed. The casual confidence of a nation that could afford to be wasteful, the material surplus that made individual items disposable, the psychological security of soldiers who knew that behind them stretched an entire continent mobilized for their support. In the end, the Colmar pocket was eliminated by late January 1945, German forces withdrawing across the Rhine or surrendering in exhausted defeat. The campaign cost thousands of lives on both sides and achieved an objective measured in miles of frozen terrain. But within that larger battle, Jones's six-day vigil represented something more subtle and perhaps more devastating, a demonstration that in total war every advantage compounds, that psychological dominance is as important as firepower, and that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones that remind the enemy not just that they are losing, but why they are losing, because they are facing an opponent who can afford to leave coffee cups lying in no man's land while they cannot even afford real coffee to drink. Years later, when historians would examine the collapse of German morale in the war's final months, they would cite familiar factors: strategic defeats, supply shortages, recognition of inevitable defeat. But the soldiers who fought in places like the Colmar pocket knew a more intimate truth, that morale erodes not just through grand strategic reversals, but through 1,000 small reminders of inadequacy, through the daily confrontation with an enemy whose soldiers casually discard what you desperately lack, through the slow realization that you are fighting not just a military force, but an entire way of life that can afford to be profligate with everything, even death. The coffee cup was bait and trap and symbol all at once, and in its simple, dented form lay a compact summary of why the war could only ever have ended one way. Jones understood this instinctively, even if he never articulated it quite that way. He was not just a sniper, he was, for 6 days in January 1945, the living embodiment of American industrial might condensed into a single rifle scope and an ordinary cup, proving that in war, as in life, sometimes the most devastating truths are delivered not through grand gestures, but through small, persistent reminders of what abundance looks like to those who have forgotten its taste.